The first warm days of spring had barely reached the valley when Daniel Carter drove his old tractor into the field. Across the road, his neighbors were planting corn in long, straight rows, just as their families had done for generations. Daniel had a different plan. After planting several rows of corn, he stopped the tractor, climbed down, and lifted a worn canvas bag from the back. Instead of planting more corn, he began placing bean seeds in the spaces between the young stalks. Old Mr. Harris watched from the fence and laughed. "Ran out of land already?" he shouted. Another farmer stopped his tractor and shook his head. "2 crops in one field? You'll lose both." Their laughter carried across the road. Daniel heard every word. For a moment, he looked at the seeds in his palm and wondered whether they were right. Perhaps he was taking a foolish risk. Perhaps the beans would compete with the corn and leave him with nothing. But doing what everyone else did had already brought him close to losing the farm. One season, a storm had flattened his corn. The next year, insects had damaged the crop. Then corn prices fell so low that his harvest barely covered the cost of fuel and seed. Daniel could not afford to depend on one crop again. He closed his hand around the seeds, knelt, and continued planting. Within days, the entire valley had heard about his unusual field. People slowed their trucks as they passed. At the local feed store, farmers spoke about his failure as if it had already happened. Corn needs space. Beans will steal the water. That farm won't survive the summer. Daniel never argued. His farm was smaller than most. He had no expensive irrigation system and no savings large enough to survive another failed season. The others were planting for the biggest possible harvest. Daniel was planting for another chance. As the weeks passed, the corn rose toward the sun. Soon, tiny bean plants appeared between the rows, spreading green leaves across the exposed soil. To everyone else, the field looked crowded. To Daniel, it looked protected. Every evening he walked between the plants and pressed his hand against the soil beneath the bean leaves. It still felt cool. It still held moisture. He did not celebrate, not yet. Far beyond the valley, weather reports were warning of an unusually dry summer. Most farmers ignored them. The sky was still blue. The fields were still green. No one imagined that within a few months, the rain would disappear, and the field they mocked would become the one they all wanted to understand. Daniel's decision had not come from pride. It had come from fear. 3 years earlier, a late summer storm had flattened nearly half his corn. The year after that, pests spread through the valley and damaged what remained. Then, the following season, corn prices fell so sharply that even a decent harvest barely covered the cost of seed, fuel, and repairs. Each year, Daniel had worked harder. Each year, the margin for survival had grown smaller. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table one winter evening, surrounded by unpaid bills and seed catalogs. His wife had placed a cup of coffee beside him and asked a simple question. What happens if corn fails again? Daniel had no answer. His father had once warned him about this. Never ask one crop to carry the whole farm, the old man had said. Weather changes, markets change. A field needs more than one chance. At the time, Daniel had ignored the advice. Like most young farmers, he believed larger harvests came from cleaner fields, heavier fertilizer, and planting as much of one profitable crop as possible. Now, he understood what his father meant. A single crop could bring a strong profit in a good year, but in a bad year, it could also bring complete ruin. That winter, Daniel began reading old farming journals and talking to older growers in nearby counties. He learned that some farmers had once planted beans beside corn, not because they were poor planners, but because they wanted their fields to produce in more than one way. The idea was simple. If the corn struggled, the beans might survive. If one price collapsed, the other crop could still bring income. And if both succeeded, the same field could provide 2 harvests instead of 1. Still, Daniel knew the plan involved risk. He had never tried it on a large scale. The timing had to be right. The spacing had to be careful. Too many beans could crowd the corn. Too few would make no difference. But doing nothing felt even riskier. So when spring arrived, he made a decision. He would not bet the future of his family on a single crop again. The neighbors saw confusion in his field. Daniel saw a second chance. And as he dropped the first bean seeds into the soil, he carried one thought with him. If the season turned against him, he wanted more than one way to survive. Spring moved quickly across the valley, and Daniel knew he had only a few weeks to make his experiment work. Every morning before sunrise, he was already in the field. Unlike his neighbors, who planted acre after acre of corn without stopping, Daniel worked much more slowly. After every few rows of corn, he returned on foot, measuring the spaces between the plants before carefully dropping bean seeds into the soil. His work looked painfully inefficient. Several passing farmers laughed as they watched him bend over row after row. "At this rate," one of them joked, "you'll still be planting when we're ready to harvest." Daniel only smiled. He wasn't trying to plant faster. He was trying to plant smarter. The spacing mattered. If the beans were too close, they would compete with the young corn. If they were too far apart, they would leave the soil exposed to the sun. Every handful of seed had a purpose. Some evenings, Daniel carried a notebook into the field. He sketched the rows, counted the distance between plants, and made small notes beside each section. Too dense. Needs more space. Better moisture. No one had taught him exactly how to do this. He was learning directly from the field itself. As the first green shoots appeared, the difference between Daniel's farm and every other farm became obvious. The neighboring fields looked perfectly clean. Dark soil stretched between every row of corn. Daniel's field looked completely different. Tiny bean plants began emerging between the corn, creating patches of green that slowly spread across the ground. Many people believed the field looked messy. Daniel believed it looked alive. His wife sometimes stood quietly at the edge of the field, watching him adjust another row. "Do you really think this will work?" she asked one evening. Daniel looked across the young plants before answering. "I don't know. But I know one thing. If we keep farming exactly the same way we've always farmed, we'll keep getting the same results." Neither of them spoke again. The only sound came from the evening breeze moving gently through the young corn leaves. Daniel looked across the field one more time before heading home. It didn't look perfect, but it looked different. Sometimes, he thought, different was exactly what survival required. By early summer, Daniel's field had changed completely. The corn now stood above his waist, its broad leaves stretching toward the sun. Between the rows, the bean plants had spread across the ground and begun curling around the lower corn stalks. To the neighbors, it looked like disorder. To Daniel, it looked like a pattern. One afternoon, Mr. Harris stopped his truck beside the fence and stared at the field. "Those vines are choking your corn," he said. Daniel walked over but did not argue. "They're not choking it," he replied. "Not yet." Mr. Harris laughed. "You'll see what happens when the heat arrives." Then he drove away. Daniel stayed by the fence for a moment, watching dust rise behind the truck. He knew the old farmer might still be right. The beans were growing faster than expected, and some had begun climbing too tightly around the young stalks. That evening, Daniel entered the field with a small knife. He loosened several vines, removed weak plants, and opened more space around the crowded corn. He worked until the last light disappeared behind the hills. The experiment was not perfect, but it was teaching him. Over the next several days, Daniel began noticing small differences. The bare soil in neighboring fields became hard beneath the sun. By midday, its surface was hot enough to make him pull his hand away. Under the bean leaves, his own soil remained cooler. When he pushed his fingers into the ground, he found moisture just below the surface. The leaves were slowing the wind. They were shading the soil. They were covering the empty spaces where water usually disappeared. Daniel wrote the observations in his notebook. Cooler beneath leaves. Less cracking. Moisture still present. He did not yet know whether those small signs would be enough to save a harvest. He only knew his field was behaving differently. A few days later, his wife joined him during the evening walk. She bent down and touched the soil beneath the beans. "It's damp," she said. Daniel nodded. Then they crossed the road and touched the exposed ground beside the neighbor's corn. It was dry and warm. For the first time, his wife looked back at their field with something other than concern. Maybe Daniel had not created a stronger crop. Maybe he had created a field that lost water more slowly. Far above them, the sky remained cloudless, and the weather forecast no longer spoke of a possible dry summer. It spoke of a drought. The first week without rain did not worry anyone. The second week made farmers check the sky more often. By the third week, the valley had changed. Dust followed every truck along the road. Grass turned pale. The ponds shrank, and the soil between the corn rows began to crack. Daniel walked through his field each morning before sunrise. The corn leaves had started curling inward to protect themselves from the heat. Some plants looked weaker than others, especially along the edges where the sun struck hardest. The beans were suffering too. Their leaves drooped in the afternoon, and a few of the youngest plants had already dried out. This was not the miracle Daniel had hoped for. It was a test. Across the road, Mr. Harris had begun running his irrigation pump almost every day. The engine could be heard from sunrise until evening, pulling water from a pond that was getting lower each week. Other farmers did the same. Fuel costs rose. Wells weakened, and every drop of water became more valuable. One morning, Mr. Harris stopped Daniel near the fence. "Still think 2 crops are better than 1?" he asked. Daniel looked over the field before answering. "I think 2 chances are better than 1." Mr. Harris shook his head. 2 crops need twice the water." Daniel said nothing. He had wondered the same thing many times. That afternoon, the temperature climbed higher than it had all season. Heat shimmered above the road, and the soil in the neighboring fields hardened into a dry crust. Daniel knelt beneath the bean leaves and pushed his fingers into the ground. The surface was dry. But a little deeper, the soil still held moisture. Not much. Just enough to matter. He began changing the way he managed the field. He stopped watering every row equally and focused only on the weakest sections. He removed damaged plants and used dry grass around exposed patches to slow evaporation. Every decision became a choice between what could be saved and what had to be sacrificed. By the end of the month, several neighboring cornfields had begun turning yellow. Some farmers still believed rain would return soon. Daniel no longer depended on hope. Each evening, he watched the beans spread shade across the ground, while the corn stood above them, battered but alive. The 2 crops were no longer simply sharing the same field. They were facing the same enemy. And the drought was about to reveal whether Daniel's gamble had been foolish or whether the field had been preparing for this moment all along. By midsummer, the drought had settled over the valley like a heavy blanket. The days became hotter, the nights stayed warm, and the wind carried dust through every open field. Many farmers had stopped talking about yield. Now they were only asking how much of the crop could still be saved. Daniel's field was suffering too. Some corn leaves had turned pale at the edges. Several bean plants near the road had withered completely. But deeper inside the field, something unexpected was happening. The soil beneath the bean canopy remained darker than the exposed ground outside it. Daniel noticed it one morning while checking the roots of a weakened corn plant. He moved aside the bean leaves and pressed a small metal tool into the earth. The first layer was dry. A few inches below, the soil was still cool. He crossed the road and repeated the test in Mr. Harris's cornfield. There, the ground was dry much deeper. Daniel returned to his own field and began studying the plants more carefully. The bean leaves shaded the soil during the hottest hours of the day. They slowed the wind near the surface and reduced how quickly moisture disappeared. The corn, meanwhile, gave the beans partial shade during the afternoon and provided stems for some vines to climb. They were not perfectly protecting each other. They were simply making the field less exposed. That difference was small, but in a drought, small differences could decide whether a plant survived another week. Daniel also noticed that the roots were not occupying the soil in exactly the same way. The corn sent stronger roots deeper into the earth, while many bean roots spread through the upper layers. The plants still competed for water, but they did not always reach for it from the same place. That evening, Daniel showed his wife 2 handfuls of soil. One came from beneath the beans. The other came from an empty patch near the fence. The first clung together slightly in his palm. The second crumbled into dust. "This is what the leaves are doing," he said. She looked toward the field. "So the beans are saving the corn?" "Not exactly," Daniel replied, "but they may be helping the ground hold on long enough." The next morning, Mr. Harris stood by the fence again. This time, he did not laugh. He stared at Daniel's field, then at his own yellowing rows. "Why is yours still greener?" he asked. Daniel looked down at the bean leaves covering the soil. "Because my field isn't standing bare." For the first time all season, the man who had mocked him had no answer. The drought continued into another brutal week. By then, many of the cornfields around the valley had lost their deep green color. Leaves curled tightly around the stalks, and entire sections had stopped growing. Daniel's field was not untouched. Some corn plants had already failed. Several bean vines had dried along the outer rows, but in the center of the field, the plants were still holding on. That was where Daniel noticed the change. The bean leaves had formed a living cover over much of the soil. Beneath them, the ground remained cooler, and the corn roots could still reach pockets of moisture that had not completely disappeared. At the same time, the taller corn stalks reduced the harsh afternoon sun falling directly on the beans. The vines used the stalks for support, climbing upward instead of spreading across the hottest ground. Neither crop was thriving, but both were surviving better together than Daniel had expected. One morning, he found the first new bean pods hidden beneath the leaves. They were small. They were not enough to celebrate, but they were proof. The field was still producing. A few days later, he inspected several corn plants near the center rows. Their ears were smaller than usual, yet they had continued filling despite the heat. Daniel stood between the rows and looked from the corn above him to the beans below. For months, people had warned him that the two crops would steal from each other. Now it seemed they were helping each other endure. Mr. Harris came across the road that afternoon. His own field had turned almost completely yellow. He picked up one of Daniel's bean leaves, then looked at the damp soil beneath it. "I thought the beans would take the water," he said. "They take some," Daniel replied, "but they also keep the sun from taking all of it." Mr. Harris remained silent. Daniel did not feel victorious. The drought was still not over, and the harvest could still disappoint him. But for the first time, he understood what his father had meant. A second crop was not only a second source of income, it could also change the way the entire field survived. That evening, Daniel counted the young bean pods and marked the healthiest corn rows in his notebook. The numbers were not impressive, but they were alive. Across the valley, farmers were beginning to prepare themselves for a total loss. Daniel was beginning to prepare for two smaller harvests. And in a year like this, two smaller harvests could mean the difference between losing the farm and keeping it. By late summer, the drought finally began to loosen its grip. The first rain came quietly during the night. It was not enough to repair the damage across the valley, but it settled the dust and brought a cool smell back to the air. Farmers stepped outside before sunrise, hoping the storm had arrived in time. For many fields, it had not. The corn had already stopped filling. Some ears were thin and nearly empty. In several places, entire rows had dried beyond recovery. Daniel's field had suffered too. His corn was shorter than usual. Many ears were smaller, and some plants had produced nothing at all. But when he walked between the rows, he found something the others did not have: bean pods. Hundreds of them. Some were small and uneven, but many had filled well beneath the leaves. The beans had continued growing after the corn slowed down, turning the shaded ground into a second harvest. Daniel stood silently in the middle of the field. He had not escaped the drought. He had survived it differently. The harvest began 2 weeks later. First, Daniel and his wife picked the beans by hand. They filled basket after basket until the porch was covered with green pods. Then Daniel returned for the corn. The yield was lower than in a normal year, but the strongest central rows had produced enough to store, sell, and feed the animals through winter. Neither harvest was exceptional. Together, they were enough. At the grain elevator, Daniel watched other farmers unload trucks carrying only a fraction of their usual crop. Some spoke quietly about unpaid loans. Others wondered whether they could afford seed for the following spring. Daniel's corn payment was modest, but he still had the beans. A local grocer agreed to buy part of the fresh harvest, while Daniel's wife preserved the rest for winter. The income did not make them wealthy, but it paid the fuel bill, covered the seed debt, and kept the farm from falling behind. A few days later, Mr. Harris arrived at Daniel's barn. He stared at the baskets of beans, then at the smaller pile of corn nearby. "So neither crop gave you a full harvest," he said. "No," Daniel replied. Mr. Harris looked toward his own nearly empty field. "But together, they gave you one." Daniel nodded. For the first time, the field's purpose was clear. It had never been designed to produce the biggest harvest in a perfect year. It had been designed to keep producing when the year was anything but perfect. Word about Daniel's harvest spread quickly through the valley. At first, people spoke about it quietly. They had seen the baskets of beans on his porch. They had seen the corn stacked in his barn. They also knew that many nearby fields had produced almost nothing. Within days, farmers began stopping by. Some came pretending they were only passing through. Others asked direct questions. "How far apart did you plant the beans? Did you use more fertilizer? How often did you water?" Daniel answered carefully. He explained that the system had not been perfect. Some plants had competed too much. Some bean vines had damaged young corn. Several rows had failed completely. But he also showed them the sections where the soil had stayed cooler and where both crops had survived. Mr. Harris visited more than once. The first time, he stood silently at the edge of the field. The second time, he brought a notebook. Daniel noticed but said nothing. They walked between the rows together, examining the dried outer sections and the healthier plants near the center. "I thought the field looked messy," Harris finally said. "It was messy," Daniel replied, "but it was not careless." Harris looked down at the bean leaves still covering parts of the soil. "I planted for the best year," he said. Daniel nodded. "I planted for the worst one." That sentence stayed with the farmers who heard it. For years, many of them had measured success by one thing: the largest possible harvest from a single crop. Daniel had measured success differently. He wanted a field that could still produce when weather, prices, or pests turned against him. By autumn, several neighbors had asked for bean seed. Daniel did not sell them a miracle. He warned them that every field was different. Soil, rainfall, spacing, and timing all mattered. What worked on his land would need adjustment elsewhere. Still, interest continued to grow. The same people who had laughed at him in spring now stood beside his barn, studying his notes and asking how they might try a few rows the following year. Daniel never reminded them of their jokes. He did not need to. The field had already answered them. As winter approached, the valley looked different. Most fields were bare. Daniel's was too. But beneath the dry stalks and fallen leaves, something had changed. The farmers no longer saw two crops fighting for the same ground. They saw two chances. And Daniel, once treated like a fool, had become the man everyone wanted to learn from. Winter arrived quietly over the valley. The fields that had been green only months earlier now lay brown and still beneath the cold sky. Dry corn stalks stood like reminders of the hardest season the farmers could remember. Daniel walked alone through his field one final time before the first frost. Most of the beans had been harvested. The corn had been stored. What remained were brittle stalks, fallen leaves, and empty rows. To anyone passing by, the field looked finished. Daniel knew it had changed everything. He stopped near the center, where the strongest corn had grown and where the soil had stayed cool longest beneath the bean leaves. That small patch had not produced the biggest harvest in the valley. It had done something more important. It had refused to fail completely. Daniel thought about the spring, when the neighbors had laughed from the fence. Back then, they saw two crops competing for the same space. Now they understood that the field had been built around a different idea. Strength did not always come from growing more of one thing. Sometimes it came from refusing to depend on only one thing. The corn had given the beans support and partial shade. The beans had covered the soil and helped it lose moisture more slowly. Neither crop had saved the farm alone. Together, they had given Daniel time, options, and a harvest when almost everyone else had only losses. Mr. Harris joined him near the edge of the field. For a while, neither man spoke. Then Harris pointed toward the empty rows. "Next spring," he said, "I'm going to try a few acres." Daniel smiled. "Start small." Harris nodded. "And pay attention." "That matters more than anything," Daniel replied. They stood in silence as the wind moved through the dry stalks. Daniel knew the system was not perfect. It would not defeat every drought, and it would not work the same way on every farm. But it had taught the valley a lesson no one would forget. A resilient field was not one that never suffered. It was one that still had another way forward when something failed. As Daniel turned toward home, he looked back once more. The field no longer seemed messy. It seemed wise. And hidden between those empty rows was the truth that had saved his farm. Nature rarely survives through strength alone. It survives through cooperation, diversity, and the courage to plant differently before anyone understands why.